Okay, so today we are going to be looking at hatching. And so I want you to turn in your sketchbook, your blue folder, to the other techniques to create value. So one of the ways you can create value, or one of the most popular ways to create value, is through shading. And so that's what we did on the last page, where we practiced our blended values here, and then we practiced creating dimension and value on our forms using shading and a light source. So we're still going to keep the light source in mind as we do this assignment, but this time, instead of shading, we're going to be using techniques that are called hatching, cross-hatching, and stippling. So you can see some of my examples here. So hatching is when you draw a series of thin lines and they all run parallel or in the same direction. So you can see that example right here. Cross-hatching is when you draw lines that crisscross each other, and you can see that example in the middle. And then on the right side, stippling is where we create values using a dot pattern. So if we look below here, we can see 3 example value scales using these techniques. So we see cross-hatching, here we see hatching, here we see stippling. So I want you to practice these techniques today. We're going to focus on hatching first. I would recommend working in pencil rather than Sharpie for this one, because if we do Sharpie, it's going to bleed through our last practice. So let's go ahead and just do pencil for this one. So something to keep in mind, for hatching lines, they can go any direction. I choose to make my hatching lines more at a diagonal. So I'm just going to start with my pencil. And when you want light values, you have a few lines really spread out. And then for this next one, I'm going to try and double the number of lines that I have. So notice I keep them going the same direction. Try and keep your spacing even and intentional looking. So with each one, we're bringing our lines closer together, because the more lines we have, the more our eyes will read that as a dark value. So with each one, I'm starting to bring my lines even closer together. And I'm also increasing the number of lines that I have in a square because I'm bringing those closer together. Try to make each square look different than the squares on either side of it. And then this last one should have lots of lines layered over the top of each other. So this one should be feeling pretty dark. Notice I'm not scribbling though, I'm still doing controlled lines as I do this last value, and essentially it pretty much fills in. You might see a little white gap here or there, but for the most part it should fill it in. Okay, now that we have our hatching value scale done, we're going to come over here to our practice stippling and hatching side. Now you're going to see some examples here up above. So our practice that we're going to do is the hatching for our cube here. Okay, so we're going to do this down below. So in this space here, and we're going to say that the light source is coming from the right here. Okay, so this is going to be our lightest side, our medium side, our darkest side, and then our cast shadows, right? So to draw a cube, we're going to start by drawing a square. And it doesn't need to be too big. I would keep it under an inch, but bigger than a half inch. Okay, so we start by drawing a square, and then we're going to draw a parallel line up above and to the right slightly, and that was a horizontal parallel line up and to the right, and then a parallel vertical line slightly to the right, and then we're going to connect our corners, and that creates our cube, right? And then from under here, this would be where our cast shadow would start to run, and it would end that angle. Sorry, this should be angled a little bit closer to what the angle is right there. Okay, so the first one we're going to do is we're going to do this light side here, remember? And if it helps, draw your arrow, or sometimes I'll even just draw a little sun to help me remember where my light is coming from. So this is going to be my lightest side. And Here's a suggestion with this one. Try and have your lines go different directions for each side of your form. So here I have them more like horizontal, and then up top I might do more diagonal. So these ones need to be closer together. And then for the front, maybe I'll have it go diagonal the other way. These ones need to be even closer together. Remember, take your time, make every line feel intentional. Don't rush. So take your time. And then here on this one, I could go back to horizontal lines here, but remember, this is going to be our cast shadow, so this is going to be our darkest value out of all of them. Okay, so that would be my cube using hatching. Now I want you to try a cone. So remember, for the cone, we would have kind of the top of a triangle with a curve of like an oval at the base. And then for this one, remember, light's over here. So our lightest side would be over here, darkest side would be here. And then for our cast shadow, it's going to extend kind of in a triangle shape off to the side here. Okay, so when you do something like this, I would recommend starting with some longer, more spread out lines that extend almost the whole thing. And then as you start to shorten your lines, you increase the number of them. So as I work my way back over here, you'll start to see that I have a lot more lines. So I'm making more lines each time, but I'm making them shorter each time. And what this does is this starts to make the one side feel a little bit darker while the rest, and if you feel like you've missed an area, feel free to extend your lines. So then again, I really start to layer them up along that edge. And then even more. And remember, these should be parallel. We're trying to not have them crisscross. Okay, so if I get finished and I feel like there's too big of a jump there, I could come back in here. So I felt like that medium range was kind of missing. So I'm just going back in and adding a few more lines. And then what I also like to do is just add a couple coming in from this side. So, and I use slightly curved lines because this is a curved form. I'm following the contour of my edges here. And then in here, since it's a cast shadow, I'm going to use just straight lines. So that way it contrasts with what I did before. Another thing you can kind of do if you're choosing to work with pencil, you can also use different pressures to enhance the feeling of dimension. Now, if this were all ink, you would be relying solely on the density of line. But if you are working with a pencil to do your hatching, cross hatching, and stippling, you can also increase or decrease pressure of those lines to help enhance your value. So there's my cone using hatching. And now let's try a sphere. So for the sphere, again, we're not going to draw too big a circle. Okay, our light source is over here. So I draw my sun to remind me of that. My cast shadow then would go the opposite way. So it'd start underneath my circle and stretch out to the left because my light is coming from the right. So again, for this one, I'm going to start with fewer lines, more spread out that extend almost the whole width of the circle. Notice that I'm curving my lines. Then I go back in and I add some shorter ones in the halfway points. And then between those, I go back in and I add some even shorter lines in between those. So we're building up our values by adding more and more lines, which also decreases then the space between the lines. And it does sometimes cause some overlap, which also can make it feel. Now, a few of these lines don't feel long enough, so I'm going to go ahead and bring them in a little bit more. And then right along this edge, I'm going to really increase my number of lines so that it feels nice and dark. And again, if it doesn't feel quite long enough for the darker area, you can go ahead and increase your number of lines coming in. Then, like I've said before, I like to have some come from the other side, just a few, so that way my form doesn't feel too flat on this edge, okay? I was still seeing a little too much white along here, so I'm just adding a few more. Okay, there's my sphere using hatching lines, and then like I've said before, for the outside edge, I'm going to do just straight lines because this is a flat cast shadow, and I'm going to have them go a different direction to help show a difference between my form and my shadow to help them look like two different objects or two different areas. So there is my cast shadow, and you can also extend these out with more space between them to make the lighter value. So what's required for this one, you need to do your hatching value scale, and then I want you to do your cube hatching example. And if you have extra time, if we have plenty of time, then we'll go ahead and do the cone and the sphere today as well.